Second on our list of studies to review that had neutral findings was Walker et al. In 2009, and they evaluated commercial palm cooling device to enhance performance. Their objective was if they could use the core control RTX palm cooling device during brief rest periods to see if it would improve performance. So they had 10 adults, 5 men, 5 women. They did a high-intensity interval running protocol on a self-propelled treadmill. Now, each session involved 8 30-second all-out sprints with 90-second walking recovery. During each 90-second rest, subjects either used the RTX device at 15 Celsius with one hand or 15 degrees Celsius gel pack or did nothing. And they measured distance run, power outage, core temp, heart rate, and perceived heat stress. So their key findings were that there were no significant differences found between all 3 conditions. Sprint distances and power declined over the 8 intervals due to fatigue, but the decay was similar regardless of conditions. Core temperature rises and heart rate rises were virtually identical across conditions, and the RTX cooling device did not slow the rate of fatigue compared to the control. So those were their conclusions. So let's take a look. They show core temperature here. As you can see in all 3 conditions, fairly consistent. It doesn't look like there is much difference. We also see that by the end of the testing protocol, temperature was still below modest levels of hyperthermia. So they were just below, it looks like 38.5 degrees Celsius in all conditions by the end of it. So heat stress likely wasn't a major factor. The core temperature didn't really get that high. It was a very short study, only 20 minutes roughly. We see similar things with heart rate. There's some variability, but they're pretty consistent in following the trend. And again, the core temperatures remain reasonable levels. So what we see here, this is really important, is let's go back. By the end of the study, core temperature gets just over 38 Celsius, but it doesn't get to 38.5. And 38.5 is where modest hyperthermia starts. So the study doesn't quite get to hyperthermia. However, you're doing 30-second all-out sprints, even from the very first sprint, and consistently maintained throughout. Heart rate is right at max. I mean, these participants are getting up to 170 beats per minute. So they are at maximum capacity heart rate and cardiovascular capability. And even their recovery period, they're still up over 140 by the time they get their 90 seconds rest done. So state of heat stress, not quite. State of absolute max capacity, absolutely. Mean power produced, pretty consistent across the board. Total distance, pretty consistent across the board. The conclusions that the authors had was that in this high-intensity interval scenario, the palm cooler did not improve performance or reduce thermal strain, and therefore in its current iteration it was ineffective. So here's a critical review. If we take a closer look, following a 5-minute warm-up, subjects performed 8 30-second sprints, so there was just 4 minutes of intense activity. It was performed in normal thermic conditions, and because we saw core temperature never even got to modest hyperthermia, it is very probable that the exertional and environmental conditions were insufficient to evoke any meaningful thermal burden. So if there's not actually a state of heat stress or a thermal burden, there's no opportunity for cooling to resolve that limitation on performance, because the limitation on performance was not thermal. Now, given that the activity chosen was extremely intense bursts, 30-second all-out sprints, it is very reasonable to suggest that performance was not limited by temperature, but performance was limited by local muscle factors and anaerobic capacity, or aerobic capacity, heart rate spiking all the way to max. So the takeaways from this critical review. These conditions were really not favorable for palm cooling to show an effect. It was also really favorable conditions for anaerobic and aerobic limitations to show the effect. So as we look through this and we look through the data, we look at the study design, the research does not negate the efficacy of palm cooling, but rather the effectiveness of this specific device, and more importantly, the application in this specific context.